So I'm doing this series called Jesus the Israelite. And the point of the conversation is to try to explore Jesus' Jewish life as the first century, Second Temple era Jew. And it's a little bit controversial because we're going to go outside of the box. I know there's been books like The Jesus I Never Knew, The Jewish Jesus, all these things from different people from all different spectrums. But what I'm trying to do is trying to pinpoint him in as a member of the Jewish people. So you can say that he had Jewish ancestry, that he had Jewish lifestyle, but to actually see him as an Israelite, as a member of the, they call it the ethno-religious civilization, that means that he had responsibilities, and back then they didn't have rights, so you only had responsibilities. Even modern Judaism, my professor was saying that there's things that you're supposed to do. Is not about what do you get out of practicing Judaism. So in the same way, I want to ask people, did Jesus ever go up to the temple and offer a sacrifice? Because that was one of the responsibilities of a male Jew. But if it, so you have to take away all the layers of theology, such as him being sinless and not needing to do that, him being God in the flesh, so he didn't have to marry. It was actually a responsibility as a Jewish male to get married. That was one of the commandments, and reproduce. So you start looking at what people have believed about him and his responsibility as a member of the kingdom of Judea at that time. There's all these unanswered questions. And even when you look at the Gospels, there's not enough information to make an assessment. So someone like you who has grown up in the church and who has lived your life serving him and his God, I wanted to see for just the normal person in the pews, do any of these things even matter, or do they ever cross their mind? Is it something that is completely outside of their purview because they're so focused on the devotional component of being a Christian? Have you ever thought about the historical and almost like anthropological aspects of Jesus as a human being?
Well, I'm a little different in that because I went to seminary, studied, we had a Judaic studies program at my seminary. Of course, it was a Christian seminary, and we did look a lot at the culture of first century Palestine and first century the world, but also because modern evangelicalism, which is what I grew up in, I think I mentioned to you the other day that I would consider my early upbringing even fundamentalist, because it is so positive about prophecy and about the nation of Israel. There was a lot of talk about the Jewishness of Jesus. Now, it wasn't so much the cultural obligations that Jesus had, and I think until I went to seminary, I never really thought about the absolute Jewishness of Jesus. Theology kind of takes us away from that. However, the dispensational theology of fundamentalist Christianity, that there are these different dispensations, that God does things differently at different times, it depends on Jesus coming from the Jewish culture and lineage. And there was a lot of study of the I'm blanking on the word, I'm getting old, the genealogies of Jesus. In seminary, there was a whole lot more thought about the Jewishness of Jesus. We actually had a professor who was a classics professor, taught Latin and Greek. Now, he had this weird idea that Jesus was a completely Hellenized Jew, and nobody, students or faculty, agreed with him. It was just like, no. Jesus went around speaking Aramaic, which was the language of the Jewish people at the time. I'm guessing he had to learn Hebrew. That would be an obligation to read in the synagogue, because we see in the Gospels he's taking his obligation to read in the synagogues. As far as temple sacrifice, if I recall, is it in Luke or Matthew where his parents offer the poor person's sacrifice at the temple at his birth? It's two doves, I believe. Whereas they were sacrificed. But the other thing too is the Christmas story where Joseph and Mary have to go to Bethlehem to be counted. Now that was a Roman thing, but I mean, it's obvious Jesus was an Israelite. It's obvious Jesus, he sacrificed in the temple. I don't know, but I wouldn't have a problem with it if he did, because he he said all the other expectations and requirements of a Jewish adult. Yeah, that might theologically still pointing to the ultimate sacrifice, as the sacrificial system in Christian theology teaches that the Old Testament sacrificial system points towards the sacrifice of Christ. So it wouldn't bother me if they found literature somehow that said he did. But we, as fundamentalist evangelicals, grew up believing in Jesus as a Jewish person. And the more I studied New Testament, Old Testament, Hebrew, and some anthropology and archaeology, not going on digs or anything, but just reading about it in books, it just was a very obvious thing to me. Now, talking about the Christian in the pew, I honestly don't think they think about it that much. I think in the evangelical tradition, it's a little more obvious to people that Jesus was Jewish. I think in some of the mainstream or mainline denominations, it may not be thought about as much, but that's just my conjecture. I just know in evangelical and fundamentalist churches, the Jewishness of Jesus is well accepted and taught. How much people think about it on the theological level every day, I doubt it very much, but it's there.
See, but that's where there's some inconsistencies, because even in the Catholic Catechism, they say that Jesus fulfilled all the law, and what that is supposed to mean is that not only that the law led up to him, but that he kept the Torah perfectly so that other people don't have to. So if he kept the Torah perfectly, that means that he ate of the Passover sacrifice. That means that he, like what's really strange is that he's almost like Clark Kent and Superman, where he's hiding who he is up until age 30. So
Yeah.
all those 30 years, he had to go and offer a sacrifice. He had to go to the mikvah and purify himself before going to the temple. Because if he didn't, the gig was up, and they would know that he was the divine Son of God. But his ministry didn't start until age 30. So all those years, he had to be pretending to partake of all these things that were created for sinful man. And in Judaism, there's the aspect of, even if you take a Nazirite vow, you're supposed to go offer a sacrifice, because the Nazirite vow stops you from enjoying life. It stops you from drinking wine, stops you from partaking of sexual relations with your spouse. It stops you from looking proper.
Yeah.
Growing your hair is actually a sign of shame in the eyes of a male Jew. So someone like John the Baptist, who was unkempt and wild, he could have been a Nazirite in the sense of he was protesting and doing a vow before God to prove something. And then Paul shaves his head when he goes to the temple to show that he was keeping the Torah in the eyes of other Jews. So this idea of the hippie Jesus with the long hair, and he's unmarried because that's not his thing. Like, none of those things matter back then. Like, there was no free choice of you could just willy-nilly keep the commandments. You had like you said, not only responsibilities but obligations, or if not, you would be kicked out of the camp, like in the wilderness. So even the thing about, maybe stretching it too far, but him disappearing for a couple of days and leaving his mom to worry, that could have put him in trouble, because you're supposed to honor your father and mother, and you can't just like, oh, I'm gonna go teach the sages about God. There's so many things that are connected, and this is not because people will say, oh, well, you're talking in rabbinic terms. You're talking about building fences around the Torah so people don't break the commandments. I'm talking about basic commandments that are given through Moses. And again, if he was born under the law, as Paul says, he was accountable to all these things. And this is where the anti-Catholic debaters will start with the Virgin Mary as well, that, was she a sinner? Because if she, there were, I don't know if you're familiar with the stuff, but they were saying that when a woman gives birth, the first 40 days, she's considered unclean, and she has to go to the mikvah. And so they were saying, they were equating being unclean with being a sinner. And I think in Jewish terms, there might be a little distinction. And now they don't really use the term unclean anymore because it's sexist. They'll say something like impure spiritually versus physically unclean. And not everything that people think is unclean according to modern rabbinic standards versus biblical standards. And a lot of these biblical standards were almost like taboos, where you couldn't do certain things because there was like a spiritual negative force connected to them. And some people think that it was oppressive, but there's a Jewish scholar of the New Testament, Amy Jill Levine, that says that a woman cannot be unclean when she's pregnant because she's still allowed to have intercourse with her husband. And the same goes for a lot of other parts of. People assume that a woman who's menstruating that cannot touch the Torah, and that's more of a minhag, that's a custom versus an actual Torah commandment. So there's a lot of misconceptions about women and purity. But now you're talking about Jesus partaking of the purity laws to be able to appear before the temple. They wouldn't even allow you to get close to the temple unless you went to the mikvaot. So when he's at that pool in, what is it called? The place where he healed the
ritual uncleanness or impurity. And I've actually puzzled a bit over Jesus not obeying his parents. That's a problem, because that's in the Jewish world, that's a fairly grave sin to defy your parents. And that's something that you have to consider and think about if you're a believer in Christ. But anyone who knows about the ritual time of uncleanness and waiting and all that stuff, when you plug all that stuff into the gospel accounts, there's things that just aren't mentioned there, and they probably did happen, and a lot of us never think about that, and it's worth thinking about.
Well, to be, and this is where some people take cheap shots at the New Testament and at the life of Jesus to try to debunk it. So they say, oh, well, he was rebellious, he was, maverick, he kept on, picking fights with everyone. And that's not fair, because around that time, there was a lot of things weren't set in stone. So that's why you hear him debating people over the right interpretation. So the whole thing about healing on the Sabbath,
right,
that was something that was being addressed because, if you really think that God rested on the Sabbath, then the whole world would implode because nobody's watching what's going on during the holy day. So he's resting, but he's supervising. And the same you could say
Well,
for providing healing. Okay?
yeah, if you're familiar at all, I'm going to switch my phone around a little bit. If you're familiar at all with the Irish philosopher of science and mathematician John Lennox, um, he talks a lot about metaphor in the Bible. And, does God rest? Does God really need to rest? No. You know, were there actually 6 days of creation? Well, it's metaphor. That way we can look at creation as theistically started and carried out in a long period of time. Now, it's a little more tricky, though, because you look at the parties, especially and I'm not knocking the Pharisees. I knew a priest who told me he really liked the Pharisees because he felt like they really wanted to do the right thing. And this priest, an Anglican priest, said that, all of his Christian life, he wanted to do the right thing. And he sort of had a soft spot for the Pharisees because they wanted to do the right thing. But, if you look at the even the words of Jesus, your holiness has to exceed, your righteousness has to exceed that of the scribes and the Pharisees. They were considered the keepers of the law and of the tradition, and yet Jesus went up against them. So as much as I believe in the Jewishness of Jesus, that he was an Israelite, he did uh, come against the religious practices of his time, at least. And the fulfillment of the law is a hard thing theologically. One can say he fulfilled the law by being sinless. One can say he fulfilled the law by providing the ultimate sacrifice. Um, it's still kind of gets a lot of Christians, concerned. You look into the book of Acts where Peter is told that no food is unclean anymore. A lot of theologians and churches deal with that by the ceremonial law versus the law of the state of Israel at the time and the moral law. And they say that the ceremonial law and the uh, uh, administrative law for the ancient state of Israel are no longer things we have to observe, but the moral law is. And a lot of people say, well, Jesus fulfilled the other two, but continues the moral law. That's a rather oversimplistic way of looking at it, but that's kind of how, especially Protestant theology looks at the fulfillment of the law. Um, it's tough because we see Jesus eating on the Sabbath or picking grain on the Sabbath and doing things that, at the time would be a violation. But he, as an informal rabbi, says, the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath, and kind of interprets the law in a different way than the Pharisees and scribes did. Um, but still, if you're a stickler for detail, those things can bother you. And as I've thought about uh, the person of Jesus Christ in the first century, sometimes those things really, stop and make me think.
Well, and I think that there's like a superficial understanding of what was going on from a lot of different individuals, starting with the church fathers, because there's a scholar, Mark Nanas, that says that even the passage where Peter and Paul are fighting over eating with Gentiles, he says that if you start with the wrong assumptions, you end up in a different place. So what he says is that, if Jesus is considered the Messiah by his followers, every meal that they partake as a group is part of the messianic banquet. And the messianic banquet cannot have treif or unclean or unkosher food because it's, again, it goes back to what's the standard. So if you're going from the Gentiles out into the Jewish in, or from the Jewish in to the Gentile out, you have the majority of majority of followers of Jesus are Jewish, and they're slowly
Right.
trickling the God-fearers and the other ex-pagans. So it's not like you would just automatically have a pig in the middle of the party. You would have mostly
Right. Right.
kosher or parv dinner, and parv means that it's neutral, that it's neither kosher or not kosher. So they're eating fish, they're eating uh, fig leaves and grapes and olives and things like that. And then what he thinks happened was that Peter was not. It wasn't about the food. It was about the people that were partaking of the food,
Yeah.
because there's this assumption that if you are hanging out with non-Jews, you're eating on kosher. But if you're the one setting up the table, this is the other way around. The Gentiles are eating kosher. So what it was is there was favoritism for the people, not the food. That in one table you had non-Jewish followers of Jesus, and in the other table you had Jewish followers of Jesus. And when he saw that there was a more strict group that came in, because there was Pharisees that followed Jesus, in the book of Acts it says that there was a group of Pharisees who still considered themselves Pharisees. So when they came in, he jumped tables and went to his fellow compatriots and dismissed the other group. And that's what made Paul mad, that he was being hypocritical based on appreciating all the members of God's kingdom. So the same goes for this idea that suddenly God takes a turn and says, it's fine, just eat whatever. And then in Mark, they say that it's a possibility that that was added later, where they say that Jesus declared all foods clean, because you have to go back to the original premise. The reason that according to Judaism, God gave a dietary menu to the Israelites was for them to be distinct and for them to be holy. And I guess it goes back to some type of taboo, that there's certain things that are inappropriate versus things that are appropriate. And then for him to suddenly change his mind or provide a different perspective, it kind of it kind of turns everything on his head. If Jesus would have said,
Yeah.
I want you guys to be vegetarian like Adam and Eve, then it would be more consistent, because then he's going back to the original diet. But instead he says, go ahead and eat whatever you want, and that just sounds crazy. And in Judaism, there's actually an idea, this is a Kabbalah thing. They say that there's two Torahs. There's the earthly Torah that is about war, it's about punishment and a lot of very tough things, and all the negative commandments. And then there's the heavenly Torah that is all the positive commandments that include love and justice and all the values, and what in Jewish circles considered to be like the essence of the Torah, like the it's called what is it called? There's two different types. There's like the mystical components, and then there's the rational components. So if you look at what Jesus was teaching, he was teaching like the mystical, deeper aspects of the Torah.
Yes.
And then he
Yes.
just takes a turn and says, well, never mind the laws of the Sabbath, never mind the laws of kosher. So he becomes schizophrenic, and it actually supports that stoic Jesus that both your professor and John Dominic Croissant, who's a friend of the show, originally was teaching. I tried to press him on that, and he kind of vacillated, because he didn't want people to think that he was making Jesus in his own image. And that's what a lot of like theologians and scholars do. There's a certain type of Jesus they would like to have, either a revolutionary Jesus or super right-wing Jesus, and then they start describing him in those terms. But Jesus doesn't fit any category. If you try to say that he was in a scene, like part of the Dead Sea Scroll community or influenced by them, he's very lean on some things and very strict on others. They were super strict on everything. If you try to say that he was a Hellenist, then why is he coming after people for lusting in their heart and committing murder in their heart? Most Hellenists would be like, whatever, as long as you're a good person, it's okay. And so there's things that are inconsistent all around to any particular perspective. And what I've seen is that he has that. There's some of the prophetic where he gets mad and he starts like coming after people, but there's also some of the apocalyptic and early mysticism things where it's all about these like almost like other realms that he's talking about. Like he's not on the plain realm. He's talking about some other realm. So in the book of John, you see all these mysteries that he's
Yes.
talking about. Like nobody knows what I'm saying, and one day they'll find out. It almost sounds Gnostic. But if you look at early Jewish mysticism, there's a lot of almost like it's like pre-Platonic ideas,
Yeah.
where again there's these spheres and these like realms that you kind of have to tune into, and if not, you don't really know what's going on, and it sounds almost like a mystery cult, and that's I think where people get like really confused, and then they say, well, he wasn't teaching Judaism, he was teaching something else, but they don't know Judaism, and they don't know that there was already some trends of that happening. And even the Talmud was influenced by some Greek ideas. So it's very complicated, and I think that's where we lose a lot
Yeah.
of people. Any thoughts?
Yeah. Sorry, I'm losing you.
Yeah, like it might be my internet or yours. Um, so I wanted to share something that people have been bringing up online. I don't know if you can hear me. Can you hear me? Hello. So I want to propose something that I was discussing with two gentlemen, and that this is going to play before our interview. So one thing to help us understand what's going on is to look at models. So in each book of the New Testament has a different model, and this is going to make people mad. But if you look at what the book of John is saying, the Gospel of John is saying, versus what the Gospel of Matthew or what Paul was saying, they all have different models. And what I was conveying with my friends is that the modern traditional Jewish model of the Messiah is different than the model of the Messiah that is depicted in the New Testament. And the model of the Messiah they had in the Dead Sea Scrolls community was a different one. And they even had like 3 or 4 different models. And what I mean by that is that usually people say that the reason that there was a Jewish rejection of Jesus, or there's even one right now, is because he didn't fit the model. So they claim that all Jews at that time, and even all Jews now, demand a warrior Messiah, a Messiah that comes and kicks butt and wipes out the enemies of Israel and sets the Davidic kingdom.
Well,
But
that's patently untrue, because the majority of the early Christians were Jewish and accepted Jesus as Messiah. Now, there's still the idea of the return of Christ as a warrior Messiah, but um, yeah, and I can't speak for anybody who is Jewish right now who might think about a coming Messiah. Most of my Jewish friends don't talk about it that much, but it in the first century anyway, um, like you said earlier, the majority of the early Christians were Jewish.
well, I want to see what you think, because there's an issue that has been kind of, they changed the focus because of the missionary activity. So in the last 100 years, there's been a push from different Christian denominations to try to convert Jews, and then it came to a head, or it had some momentum in the 70s, and it brought about the Messianic and Hebrew roots movement. So
Yes.
there was an emphasis on the Isaiah 53 as the proof text for Jesus being the Messiah. So what some members of the Jewish community decided to do is that to bring up interpretations that dismiss Isaiah 53 being the Messiah, and that it's for the people of Israel, that the Jews have taken upon the sins of humanity and they've been persecuted. And it has an emotional appeal because it's almost connected to the pogroms, the expulsions, the Holocaust. And there is something to that the Jewish people are almost like the canary in the mine, that whenever Jews are being persecuted, we know that humanity is going in the wrong direction. But there are Jewish interpretations of Isaiah 53 being the Messiah. So in rabbinic lore, they interpreted Isaiah 53 as being the Messiah, but him being one of the many Messiahs. So there's a tradition that the Messiah is killed by some type of enemy of the people of God, and then another Messiah arises and he brings him back. So you have two Messiahs versus one. So that's the model that it is the traditional Orthodox or Jewish model that has been around for the last 2,000 years. But the model that is presented in the New Testament is that the Messiah has two lifespans. He has the earthly life where he dies as a suffering servant, and he has the heavenly or glorified body state where he returns, and then he becomes the warrior Messiah, because he kind of gave people a chance to repent, and then he came back once the time was completed. And I guess that goes into the dispensation. There was a grace that was given after his resurrection to allow as many Gentiles as possible. But they're all models. Like the model is that the Messiah has two manifestations or advents, versus the rabbinic perspective where there's two Mashiachs and they play different roles. And in the Christian one, have one that plays two different roles.
I knew it. I
Good.
actually knew an Anglican priest who did not think that the passage in Isaiah necessarily was a predictor of Jesus Christ. He thought it was a predictor of another, not necessarily a Messiah, but another hero of the Jewish nation and culture that would assist in the more immediate deliverance of the needs of the people of Israel. He believed in proofs for the resurrection, and that was his view of why he believed in Jesus. But he didn't agree. He would agree with the more recent Jewish interpretation that did not necessarily mean Jesus as Messiah. It was a very complicated theology, but he was a very smart guy, and I took pains to listen to him for a long time. He did a lot of lectures on this, and so it's interesting to me. It was interesting to me that this Christian priest kind of threw out a passage of the Hebrew Bible that Christians for the last 100 years have really hung a lot of their weight on, and it was interesting to listen to him.
Well, what I think drives people crazy is that you have competing models within the New Testament. So Paul's model of Jesus is that he's the divine essence of God manifest on earth, and that he, I don't know if it's like the same or similar to the book of Hebrews. The book of Hebrews goes further than Paul in my estimate, because it puts the Messiah at the creation of the world in him, and it gives the divine attributes of God to the Messiah, to the point of like he wraps himself with the clouds, and he uses psalms that nobody else uses. Throughout the New Testament, you see psalms being used to point to King David or the fulfillment of the Son of David, and then you see just proof texts throughout the scriptures. But the book of Hebrews uses proof texts for the existence of God and applies them to Jesus. Paul is almost like a hybrid between the Johannite model of Jesus as being the memra or the logos, and being God manifested information. It's almost like in the Matrix, where the information creates a universe, and then you walk into the universe.
Yeah.
So his is he's the logos, but he's more than the logos because now he's God's. There's a term that he uses where he's almost like God's divine essence in person or something like that. The fullness of the glory or something like that, where the fullness of deity dwells in him.
Yes, the fullness of the glory of the Father.
So now,
Yeah.
so you have that one, and then in Matthew you have a different model. So they're all, when you try to syncretize them, when you're trying to match them all to one idea of Jesus, or multiple perspectives of Jesus, but they're all true at the same time, that's when it becomes very overwhelming. Because in the book of Revelation, you also see this Jesus manifested as a lamb, and then he's manifested as an angel, and then but you still have God the Father on the throne. So I started a debate with a group on Facebook because they were saying that Jesus was Hashem or Adonai the Son, and I don't really see that. There's a passage in Zechariah where it says that Hashem will put his feet on the Mount of Olives, and that's also a proof text for missionaries. But that's like a very specific, and there's also some terms that are used, like they call him in the prophecy that is never mentioned in the New Testament, the one about wonderful counselor, mighty God, everlasting Father from Isaiah.
Yes.
Uh,
Yes.
One of the terms that is used for that individual is El Gibor, and that is some main title for the God of the Old Testament. Um, so either they're giving humans the term for God, like I don't know if you remember in the Old Testament, there was people who had very great names like Adonaiah and things like that, where it would be just some kid and he would have like the name is like someone being called Emmanuel. Um, it means God with us, and they would give that to just any human being. So there was people throughout Scripture that had these almost like divine titles as a name. So then it says that someone will have all the divine titles. So that's another proof text that is used by missionaries for Jesus. So I think that the New Testament writers are drawing from all those ideas.
Well, this Anglo. You dropped off there for a little bit.
Just what were you saying about the Anglican priest?
Yeah, he was in agreement that those titles, as laid out in Isaiah, could not really be used as prophecy for Jesus. He said, yeah, you could say that, but you could also say it was related to other issues, other people in the near future, not the Messiah, not Jesus. He did not like to use those portions of Isaiah as an apologetic for Jesus as Messiah. He believed that, but he believed it for different reasons.
You see, and this is where I think it's important because he was being intellectually honest. The reason that I call it
Yeah.
intellectually honest is because even the Pope or different people have said that if you look at the passage and you apply it to whoever was living in that time, it doesn't have to be prophetic. And they do that with the Psalms.
That's right.
They say,
That's right.
Psalm 2 says, today I have become your father. Ask of me and I will make the nations an inheritance for you. And they say, well, the most automatic interpretation of that is that he's talking about Solomon, and that the kingdom of David was enlarged and had a bigger impact than through Solomon and through David. But there's some problems because it didn't really reach from the Euphrates all the way to the sea, and so there's still like a missing element. And then people say, well, if you look at it scholarly, it's metaphorical. Like, it's not the physical, because people were saying that when the state of Israel was, reinstituted as a modern state, they were saying that it had to be the biblical, prophetic state of Israel, that it couldn't just be a little sliver, that it had to be all the way to Iraq. And that caused a lot of, you know, turmoil
Yeah.
for the Muslim community. And they're like, oh, no, well, it's not right now. It's when the Messiah comes back or when he shows up, then he's going to take over that. I was like, but he's supposed to take over the whole world. Um, so theology is a little funny because you can kind of do what you want with it and say that it's later fulfillment versus modern fulfillment or ancient fulfillment. But when you start doing a tit for tat, like your version of the psalm is about Jesus and my version of the psalm is about King David or Solomon, then you really don't get anywhere. And
that's right. Yeah.
Abraham Joshua Heschel, one of my heroes, said that anybody that tries to debate the Bible will end up losing because you can interpret the Bible any way you want. Even if you follow interpretive tradition, you can get into all kinds of rabbit trails and end up in a fight. So what I want is, go ahead.
Well, it's one of those things. There's certain, among Christians, there's certain things that I refuse to debate, just absolutely refuse to debate with people. How old is the earth? Well, you can say it's 6,000 years old if you want. You can say it's, a couple billion years old if you want, a couple million years old if you want. I'm not going to debate that. I have my opinions. I have what I think. The other thing, I don't debate the beginnings and I don't debate the end, because you and I talked a little bit before, I think when we met last week, about how the dispensational eschatology is an innovation. It's been around for not even quite 200 years. And in the scope of 2,000 years of Christian theology, that's an innovation. And I think there's people in the past in the church that would call it actually a heresy because it's too far different from what was, handed down by the apostles, so to speak. But I won't argue that stuff with people because people get crazy about it, and it's just not worth my time. But it's the same thing too. People have. I saw a cartoon one time about, now this was about 30, 35, 40 years ago, about, the evangelical perspective of Jesus. And it had Jesus wearing his robe with a tie and a tie clip, and he was teaching with an overhead projector. That was a big fad among evangelical preachers to use an overhead projector back, 35, 40 years ago. And this cartoon, it was written by a Christian, it was drawn by a Christian. So it's like the modern evangelical view of Jesus, and it had Jesus with his nice tie and his robes and his overhead projector. And some people, like you said, they get really upset if you dislodge their idea of who Jesus is, whether it's historical or theological or mystical or whatever. And constantly, like you said on Facebook, I'm constantly having people say, well, this is who Jesus really was. The other day, and I wasn't going to get mixed up with this. One of my friends on Facebook we were talking about how when you try to really serve the least of these, when you try to serve the immigrant, the homeless, the poor, the sinners, that the church shows you the door. The church says, we really don't want those people here. And one person's comment was, yeah, Jesus was a hippie. And it's like, well, I kind of get what you're saying, but I'm not going to argue with you, but it bothered me a little bit because that's just too simplistic, So we all in the Christian faith have our ideas about who Jesus is, and it's hard going back to Jesus as a first century person for especially modern evangelicals, where their faith is so informed by politics and culture and the conveniences of modern society and their mode of worship. It's really hard to get your mind wrapped around the historical context of the first century and what Jesus lived with. I used to say, if I were going to be the Messiah, I'd have showed up after air conditioning was invented, because I wouldn't want to be in first century Palestine in the heat. But that's kind of a joke that some people look sideways at me about. But at any rate, people do. They have their mind made up about things, and they don't want to be informed by it, especially when it comes to Old Testament prophecy concerning Jesus. Or out of respect, I should say Hebrew Bible prophecy.
Are you familiar with the TV show called The Chosen?
No, I'm not. No.
So there's a guy. His last name is Dallas. He's a Texas guy he's been making movies about Jesus for his church, and he got this really good actor. I think he's Turkish, and he plays a really good version of Jesus. So then he got like $1 million, and he did one season of the life of Jesus, and they got all the way to the woman at the well, and then now season 2 just came out, and I made a fuss about it because the book of John is the most um, contentious book in scholarly circles when it comes down to anti-Jewish rhetoric, and um, they'll say that it's also the least historical because there's it was written later, and if you look at the way things are communicated by the time it got there, it's too sophisticated to have been an eyewitness account. But the passage where Jesus stops in Samaria and asks the lady for a cup of water while his followers went to get food is a super powerful passage when it comes down to a Jewish understanding of the world. And what I was trying to tell people is that in that passage itself, Jesus is actually very particularistic and not universal as he's usually portrayed. He tells the woman, "You guys worship what you don't understand." He tells the woman, "We know what we worship, and there's going to come a time where people are going to worship in spirit and truth." He says that salvation is of the Jews or comes from the Jews. Like all kinds of things that go contrary to a lot of people's theology. And
Yes.
sadly, in the TV version, they took all that stuff out.
Oh, that's too bad.
And they,
I think I read an article about the show now that you've talked about it, but it's been a while back, and it was just a print article that I read about it, so I don't really know that much about it.
so if you put side to side what it actually says in the Gospel of John and the script for the show, they made it emotional and they made it about the woman's challenge with multiple marriages and stuff like that. And that is a crucial aspect of the story, and it has a very poignant case to be made. But all those things that he says, where he's critiquing the Samaritans, and if you look later in the book of Acts, it seems like there's almost like a Samaritan um, like propaganda piece, like in a lot of ways, by not making it about the temple, by not um, being so particularistic, and actually the Holy Spirit landing on Samaritans and other groups. It's actually moving away from the authorities of Judea and Jerusalem. And that's what some people say, is that it wasn't really a war between Jesus and the Jews. It was a war between the Galileans and the Jerusalemites. And in the translation, they make it the Jews did this, the Jews did that, but the same word for Jew, Jehudi, could mean the Judeans. And to assume that Jesus is not a Judean is to kind of commit a crime against the text, because he's a Judean per se, in the sense of he was part of the land of Judah, but he was known as a Galilean. So as a Galilean, he spoke differently, he thought differently, and the Judeans had more power because they were at the capital. So for him to reach out to the Samaritans, that was a no-no, because they were not only not Judeans, they were also enemies of the state at that time because of their history. So he broke those boundaries, but it was with caveats. It wasn't like, go ahead and join us. It's like, go ahead and join us once you change your mentality about where God dwells in the temple, how Jews perceive the Torah, and things like that. So I just find it fascinating that as pro-Israel as evangelicals are, and I had people lecture me that the writers of The Chosen, this TV show we're talking about, went to Israel and they walked around with a Messianic rabbi, and they were informed by another Messianic rabbi who's Kathy Lee Gifford's personal spiritual guide, that how dare I question the legitimacy of the show when it just took out all this very important information that maybe later they'll bring it back up. But I was just happy to see that Jesus walks around wearing tzitzis. That was enough for me.
Well, I had a Southern Baptist professor many years ago. The guy was just a wonderful man, and he taught both Old Testament and New Testament, but Old Testament was his favorite. He loved the literature of the Old Testament. His Hebrew for scholarly purposes was flawless, and New Aramaic as well. And I was 18 years old when I first started to study with this guy, and coming right out of 18 years of fundamental evangelical home life and church life and all that, the way he taught wasn't, listen, you really don't understand the first century. It was, listen, look how beautiful all this is. Look at this great tradition of the Hebrew Bible. And look at Jesus as he walks among his fellow Jewish people, how he's different, but yet he has a way of addressing things that only someone from the inside could address and have a following. And of course, there were people who didn't like him. I mean, any revolutionary, and I'm not using that in the liberation theology context, but in the theological and in the spiritual context. But he would say, and this guy just loved, he was a guy from California, white Anglo-Saxon guy from California, but loved the Hebrew Bible and loved the traditions of the Jewish people. And he'd come back from Israel and have little artifacts that he'd bring and show us that he had been able to bring back for the school's collection. But he had no problem with the Jewishness of Jesus. Now, as a Christian, his theology and his interpretation of Jesus is going to be different than a Jewish scholar's interpretation. But that was really not the first time I could understand the total Jewishness of Jesus, because it was part of the evangelical culture. But he stripped away, and he purposely stripped away some of the cultural baggage that came with our understanding of the Jewishness of Jesus. He was the first one I ever heard to say, be very careful about paying attention to some of these political evangelicals. And this was very early on when Jerry Falwell Sr. and those guys were getting started. He said, be very careful about listening to those folks, and be very careful about making Jesus some kind of standard for anything but what you read about Jesus in the Gospels and in the New Testament. So while I don't think I had the same understanding of first century culture and life that you do, David, it is not at all offensive, or it's not at all foreign for me to think of the Jewishness of Jesus. And when you talk about him as a Judean and a Galilean, that makes perfect sense to me. That talks to the Samaritan woman about, that salvation comes from the Jews. Now, we look at that a little differently than perhaps Jewish people do, but that was one of the foundational points of faith when I was growing up. That I think I mentioned to you when we met that when I was living in New Jersey as a little kid, a lot of my schoolmates and a lot of the neighbors were Jewish. And I had it hammered into me from my parents the Jewish people are special people because salvation comes from the Jews. Now, that's interpreted through Jesus, but it's not the old medieval, the Jews killed Jesus, so we're against them either. You know, it's kind of the antithetical side, or the complete opposite to that. So I've had an interesting training and upbringing in that regard. The fact that my seminary actually had a Judaic studies program where you could get a master's degree and go to Israel and study and do all that stuff, it put a different perspective and a little different atmosphere, I guess I should say, for people preparing for Christian ministry.
So we're gonna put this in the beginning of the interview, since I didn't introduce you. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself and about that program within your seminary? Which seminary did you go to, and what made them be more interested in the Jewish understanding of both the Hebrew Bible and the New Testament to kind of broaden your horizon?
Let me start with, I got a bachelor's degree at Taylor University in Upland, Indiana. It's a very small evangelical college. I studied psychology, and I studied basically Christian religion. I didn't have I had a major in psychology. I had enough courses for a major in biblical studies, but because I didn't do the capstone for it, which is like a thesis or a special course for it, I didn't have a double major, but I had all the courses for the major except for that. Then a couple years later, after working in higher education, I'd gone to Ball State University, got a master's degree in higher education administration, worked there for a little while, then went to Ashland Theological Seminary in Ohio. There was a guy who had studied history at Kent State University by the name of David Roush. And somehow he got connected with the president of the seminary. He'd heard one of his lectures about, the need for Christians to understand their Jewish roots and Jewish tradition. And he also would say, Dr. Roush would also say, if you are a Western Christian, you have to understand your Catholic roots as well, which is something we miss out on a lot, but that's a story for a different day. He says, if you don't like Catholic theology, you have to look at how it has impacted anyone in the West, Protestant or Catholic. The Eastern Orthodox Church is a different issue. So he was very mindful of history, especially the history before the time of Christ and before the Common Era. And because the president was so impressed with him, he was brought on for this program in Judaic studies. Now, we also had a professor by the name of David Baker, who was a scholar in Near Eastern languages, Arabic, Hebrew, Aramaic. He had done, I believe, his training in England, if I'm not sure. It's been a while. He was a Canadian gentleman, and I believe he had his doctorate from University of London. So those two together, it was a small school, but those two together formed the core of that kind of a program. Unfortunately, Dr. Roush moved over to the university side. Ashland Seminary was part of Ashland University, and he moved over to the university side. You could still do the Judaic studies courses, but you had to walk a mile down the street, take them with undergraduates and do extra for graduate credit. But I took several courses with Dr. Roush, and one especially was, he was friends with several rabbis in the area. And at Sukkot, we were invited to a conservative synagogue temple for the Sukkot services. And the rabbi was incredibly, what's the word I'm looking for? Met with us for a couple hours before the service, explained the service, explained the type of worship. And so because of those kind of influences, and because of Dr. Roush's presence there at the seminary, I recall in other courses, especially New Testament courses, the professors referencing, well, here's what Dr. Roush would say about this, and if you'd like further thought on that, go ask him. you know. So that was where academically, anyway, I got interested in this. I'm not knowledgeable. My work as a Christian worker has been more practical and pragmatic. As you know, I'm a hospice chaplain, and I think I mentioned to you before, we worked in mental health services, homeless services, immigrant assistance. I've done a lot of things, especially here in Tucson in the Southwest. But I'm not a scholar um, of these things. But as a practical, someone who's trained for practical ministry, it was nice to have a lot of that stuff beside, you know, how to preach, how to counsel, how to work with community organizations to serve your people, that kind of stuff. And while, you know, I don't have the scholarly knowledge of it that some dedicates their life to that would, I'm thankful for the at least the light that was exposed through different courses. The gentleman at Taylor University was a guy by the name of Dr. Larry Hellier, and he had done his studies at Fuller Theological Seminary in California, and Fuller is one of the flagship evangelical seminaries. But he had a deep, deep love for the culture and archaeology of the ancient Near East, and loved going to Israel. And I do believe he learned modern Hebrew during his time in Israel, because he was so, because I remember he would start talking to us in Hebrew, and it sounded like, you know, what you'd see in the movies is modern Hebrew. So I didn't know if it was or not. So.
In today's show, we have Tom Saunders. He's a hospice in Tucson, Arizona, and we'll be discussing our topic, Jesus the Israelite, where we kind of talk with different people about their experience with you know, the Jewishness of Jesus, or Israel as someone growing up in the first century in the Second Temple of Judaism. Did I pronounce your name properly? Is it Sanders or Saunders? Tom?
Saunders.
Um,
It's you're kind of you're dropped out, but Saunders and Sanders is really the same name. It's from, you know, England. It means belonging to someone named Alexander, either a serf or a religious follower, or a soldier in the army of a guy named Alexander. So we weren't royalty.
well, you might be Jewish, because I don't know if you know Jason Alexander, and there's a lot of Jews with last name Alexander, because he was good to the Jews.
I did a DNA test. Yeah, I did a DNA test, and I have a very small percentage of Ashkenazi genetics. I also have South Asian, like the Indian subcontinent, a little bit of that. But for the most part, it's just boring white bread, middle of the road English. I had hoped it would be a little more exotic. I'll take my little 2% of Ashkenazi and 3% of South Asian, but the rest of it's just boring white guy English.
Well, before you go, I want to do an experiment and see how this works. So you've been working in chaplaincy for, you said 16 years?
16 years, yeah. Just crossed the 16-year mark this week, last week. Actually, I think the day I met with you was my 16th anniversary with Casa de la Luz Hospice, yeah.
Wow. So let's say that they hired some young chap, and he comes in, and you're talking, and you're saying, well, my experience with chaplaincy has been this. This is how I counsel people through grief and life challenges and health issues. And he says, well, that's fine and dandy, but let me show you from the Word of God how to care for those in need. How would you react to someone like that?
I don't think my boss would hire somebody like that, especially if he had me sit on the interviews like he does sometimes. What I would do is I would probably listen to the person. I'd probably say, okay, let's get lunch. You know, you tell me what you think. And I think I mentioned to you that I didn't do CPE, and I wish I had, but I've learned a lot in 16 years. The way I view chaplaincy is twofold. It is both spiritual, well, it's spiritual, social, psychological, emotional, all that. And I'm going to take advantage of every non-religious tool and counsel that I can get on how to deal with people. Because I have a degree in psychology, I have 2 degrees in education. I'm thankful for what research has shown on how to assist people in both learning and healing. I would also say that my job, and this is what I tell people, I'm not your pastor, I'm not your clergy. I'm someone who's a person of faith who wants to walk beside you in your journey. And it's your journey, so I'm going to walk a half a step behind you, and you just tell me where I can help you. As much as I'm a Christian, I'm also, and not completely, just I have some libertarian tendencies. I couldn't be a libertarian because I think that's too close to anarchy. But when I meet with patients, I tell them, this is your life, this is your journey. Let me walk beside you, and I will help you and support you however best I can, spiritually and emotionally. I would tell, some young kid that came in to tell me how to be a chaplain, I'd tell them that.
Well, so we'll have you back on the show to discuss chaplaincy more thoroughly, but I gave you a trick question, and the young man that did that was Jesus. And, and that's how he talked to the Pharisees and the teachers of the laws and everybody. He's like, there are some things you're doing right, like, you sit in the seat of Moses and you tell people some things, but you do other things. Or when he healed the leper, he sent the leper to go get checked by the priest. So there was a sense of respect, like, well, I can see that you guys think you know what you're doing, but let me tell you the right way. And of course, there's a response like, whoa, 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 like, who's this guy? And then I guess the more you get to know the person, you realize that they are talking from a pure place. Like, it's not arrogance, it's not trying to shut down the other people, it's trying to bring them back to the original source or the intent behind some of those passages. So I just wanted to see how would you react. And there was this silly movie called Joshua. I don't know if you ever read the book. Or
I read the book. Yeah, I read the book.
So
yeah.
they turned it
written by a Catholic priest, right?
I think so. They turned it into a movie in the early 2000s, and it was terrible because a lot of they were trying to put the life of Jesus in modern terms, and it didn't really translate. So they had like a Catholic, a Presbyterian, and a Lutheran were the Pharisees, and then Jesus kept on getting into trouble with them. And I think Peter was some type of pastor that Jesus was always giving a hard time, and he was slowly learning. He was like a fisherman, like he liked to fish, and it was silly, but it's like modern Jesus version of the life of Jesus. But they couldn't really pull off the crucifixion. They couldn't really pull off a lot of things. It almost turned into gospel, where it was clownish.
Yeah.
So I don't know, but hopefully we can all come to a better place just looking at things from an objective manner. And I listened to this guy. He claims he's an expert in religious studies, but he twisted religious studies to mean biblical criticism. So he said, well, I'm an expert in biblical studies, and we bring in archaeology and anthropology and sociology and all these things. And all he was doing was to try to like dismiss major concepts of religion. So on one hand, I appreciated that he was taking all the things that I think are important, but on the other hand, he was using them as ways to dismiss not only the Bible but Judaism. That's what was interesting, because the kid that was interviewing him told him, well, was there really a Jewish kingdom, and was there really a Moses and stuff like that? And this guy was like, let me show you how there's no proof. and they were using anachronistic terms like they were calling Moses and the Israelites Jewish when that term didn't come into the forefront until like the time of Esther, and it's used in the New Testament. But again, it could mean Judean or it could mean something else because it wasn't really an ethnic term. It was more like you were part of the kingdom of Judea. So there's all these issues that come up, and it almost becomes like the first line of attack from atheists and so-called scientific inquirers is to start attacking the Jews. Because if you attack the Jews, then you can knock down Jesus and Christianity afterward. They're like the foundation. But they don't understand that medieval and rabbinic Jews are part of the same spectrum, coming all the way from the biblical writers. So it branched off into different groups. So you can like transpose modern Jews, ancient Jews, all of them into the same categories, and so it's just very problematic. But I'm a big advocate of helping people be aware of other people's experiences. You can never like fully master somebody else's history, but at least be aware of things that you might not even think of. And I feel that that's a huge need in our diverse world that is coming about. Is that if we get stuck in our ways of looking at the world and our own stories, then we miss an opportunity to provide better care.
That's right. That's right.
So, thank you so much, and we'll be talking soon. And I appreciate your time.
I appreciate the time too, David. Good to see you again, and thanks for having me on. I appreciate it.